And so if I am a merchant selling in control swag online and
You'd be sold out. They'd be sold
I
out.
I think so, they're pretty cool. Um, Hello and welcome to In Control, where we learn about the finance of everything. I'm Tash, your host, and I'm also the CEO and founder of Cable, which supports the show. Back in early 2018, when I was at Monzo, we started hearing about customers that were transacting on their account, and they were seeing some transactions from merchants in Brazil that they had not authorized. The payments were not very large, but there were lots of them, and they were draining all the money from these people's accounts. Every time we blocked one merchant, another one was used. We did some digging and realised that all of the accounts had made a Ticketmaster purchase a few days before these Brazilian transactions happened. We tried to contact Ticketmaster, but they denied that they had been breached in any way, despite the overwhelming evidence that we had. And we ended up replacing all the affected users' cards at large expense to us. And it took Ticketmaster months to admit that they had been wrong and that their website had been compromised. And we've all been there. We notice an unusual transaction on our bank statement or credit card bill and have to go through the annoyance of getting a new card and switching our subscriptions. In-person card fraud rates are also much higher here in the US than in Europe because of the way that we pay for things at restaurants, for example. It's pretty embarrassing when my mum comes to visit because we'll be eating out and the waiter will bring the check, but she won't let her card out of her sight. So she insists on walking up with the waiter to the register and running the transaction herself, and the waiter obviously looks totally confused. Anything to avoid having to replace your card. So why is card fraud so prevalent? We share our 16-digit card numbers with people all the time on the phone. Is that safe? And how could we secure our card details better? I want to understand this area of fraud and particularly the merchant side of things much better. And so I'm speaking to Colin Luce, CEO and founder of Basis Theory, to learn some more. Colin, thank you for chatting with me today. And I want to start by asking you how you ended up working in this space. Do you have some kind of horrific fraud story that threw you into card tokenization?
No, I just think like there's no more exciting dinner conversation than, credit card data security and PCI compliance.
PCI, SOC 2, which choose your favorite, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. No, look, I think the honest answer is, I joined Klarna, which at the time was a, Swedish invoicing company, back in 2014. And that was kind of my first foray into the global payments landscape. And I think one of the, trends and I in particular was noticing working with these, global by default merchants was one, navigating the complexities of local payment schemes and local acquiring needs and consumer preferences on a local yet global scale was forcing merchants to rethink their payment stack and what it would look like to decouple it and have a more flexible one-to-many approach as opposed to relying on a single provider. And if you kind of peel back the onion on that, the core technology required to do that in a safe, secure, and simple way is tokenization. And so, that was the impetus. It obviously was joking. Nothing kills a dinner conversation quicker than PCI compliance and data security. But that's okay. I like to, talk about other stuff at dinner anyways.
You might have fun with my mum, though, with her worry about her card. So maybe.
Yeah. No, you're right. Like, actually, those are the people that are actually most interested in this. So.
Yep. So let's start at the beginning. I'd love for you to help me understand the most common ways that people have their card details stolen. Is it just, the dodgy waiter who swipes your card on a machine? Like, how do card details get stolen?
Yeah, look, it can range anywhere from your physical card being stolen. It could range anywhere from, these ATM swipers stealing the card. I think we're much more used to, the digital nature of this, your Ticketmaster example. I mean, I still remember Target was actually the first big canonical example of this. I can't even remember when it was. It had to have been early, mid, kind of, 2005, 2007, sometime in that time frame. But look, like I actually think the more interesting purview to look at this from is like, I just don't know how much, other than your mom, consumers really care. And the reason for that, and like obviously, I'm taking a somewhat like domestic lens on this from a U.S. consumer perspective, but like I've had my card stolen, I've lost my card, and like it's one phone call, usually takes less than 3 to 4 minutes. They overnight you a new card in the mail the next day. They take care of any fraudulent transactions for you. And so like from a consumer perspective, like I don't know how much we do or really should care. I mean, it continues to blow my mind that, we have these very strict and rigid requirements for how you store credit card information, a la PCI compliance, but there is no regulation or requirement for how you store a social security number, for example. But again, on this spectrum, I would, by an order of magnitude, rather have my credit card stolen than my SSN stolen. And so it's just like this like weird mismatch in terms of how much I care, and the friction associated with that data getting stolen is like opposite, relative to the regulatory requirements of how merchants and platforms and, software companies are required to interact with that data, which is, I think, kind of interesting.
That is interesting. I wonder if, in your experience, the cards that have been stolen, are they usually credit cards?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
And
again, like there's so many different lenses we could look at this
yeah.
from: credit versus debit, in store versus online, swiping of a credit card versus through a digital wallet. And all of those have different ramifications in terms of who's responsible for the fraud, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that is probably a cultural thing as well, because in the UK, people very often use their debit card to make payments, and so
Totally.
the credit card insurance doesn't kick in, which is maybe why it's not such of a big deal here. Okay, so
Totally.
like that's really interesting. If like consumers don't really care about this, the regulations around how merchants store card details, talk us through that. Like what is required of merchants?
Yeah. So look, there's this, requirement called PCI compliance, which is, I don't know, 160 pages around what is required of you if you want to touch, interact, or store credit card information. Now, the reality of how that plays out is much more complicated and nuanced. First and foremost, you know, most, at least smaller merchants simply outsource that or rely on their PSP to do that for them. So Stripe handles PCI compliance for you as a small merchant. Adyen handles PCI compliance for you as an enterprise merchant, so long as you are exclusively working with them as your PSP, that works fine. Now, there is this other dynamic where Visa and MasterCard have rules whereby, based on the number of transactions you as a merchant do in a given year, there's a threshold by which you have to get PCI compliant, irrespective of whether you store that information or not. It's just like the scope of those requirements and the associated audit is just like much more de minimis or minimal if you're not storing it. Once you start storing it yourself, like that's when you start to get into, I have to adhere to all 160 pages of this, versus I just check all these boxes that say my PSP does this for me, my PSP does this for me. But again, insert macro tailwinds being the driver behind me wanting to start a data security and compliance company. Increasingly, what we're seeing by mid-sized to large enterprise merchants is a desire to take more control over that stack and store credit card information themselves. And what's required there is essentially leveraging vault architecture, which says, hey, we're going to isolate this sensitive data, in this case, credit card information, in this box over here. And then we can reduce the burden on all of our other systems from a scope perspective. Now, that obviously introduces a lot of risk, cyber liability, compliance, et cetera. But I think what we've found is that the trade-offs between, those aspects relative to the value, the business value they see by having more control over their payment stack, it's a trade-off worth taking. But really the answer is you shouldn't be building that yourself. You should be leveraging, cloud-based, infrastructure like basis theory to do that.
Okay, loads there. I wanna walk through. So if we step back and you're at a restaurant and your card is swiped by some dodgy waiter, the customer says to the bank, "These weren't me." The bank repays the customer, the consumer. Is that right?
So again, really depends. So here in general, the rule I would say is if it's a physical retailer or a restaurant. So to your point, like physical swipe, the merchant or restaurant is responsible for that fraudulent transaction because the networks and the banks basically say you should have been able to,
Yep.
see that credit card belonged to Steven, not Tosh, right? Yep. In general, card not present transactions, so e-commerce and online transactions, the risk of that flows to the merchant
through 3D Secure and other mechanisms like that. Yeah.
So 3D Secure is different. That's actually where liability shift comes in, and that's where actually the issuing bank tends to be responsible. So same thing with digital wallets. So Google Pay, Apple Pay, which have, step up authorizations out to the issuer embedded in it, those tend to come with liability shift. So when you're using a digital wallet online, or you go through 3DS, that's when the liability actually shifts to the issuing bank from the merchant.
From the merchant. Okay. And so as a merchant, why I can see, you want to take payments, you've got a bunch of consumers, maybe they're online, maybe they're in person. You just want to be able to take a payment and you want to be able to do that compliantly and without having to pay out for, fraudulent transactions. The easiest way to do that, it sounds like, is to work with a PSP like a Stripe, like an Adyen, someone like that who presumably they just enable you to take those payments. They handle all the compliance on the other side of it.
Yeah.
And so what are the benefits for a merchant to have multiple PSPs or to take, as you said, like more control of their payment stack? What does that mean?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people tend to assume it's about like an economic play, this idea of least cost routing and optimizing between processors for whoever's going to charge the least. That's not really true. I mean, cost always plays a component in everything, of course, but the reality is for most enterprise merchants, the benefit or optimization effort tends to be more about performance, or put another way, conversion authorization rates. And so again, if you outsource all of this to a single PSP, they're going to handle the compliance, the security, all of that. But because they're handling that for you, it's going to be a tight box by which they're going to let stuff through, right? They're going to have a lot tighter controls on everything. It's classic like risk liability hot potato, right? Like it sounds great in theory when there's liability shift or someone's going to do this for you, but like there's no such thing as free lunch, right? And so the downside of that comes at a lower conversion rate because they're inherently going to be more risk or fraud averse, right? And so when merchants start taking more control over this, they're able to optimize across multiple of them. Again, even if it means taking on more risk as a merchant, you're able to sell more goods, you're able to acquire more users, like you're able to grow your business in a way where those trade-offs tend to make sense.
And that's where you end up seeing on a single merchant site, the buy now, pay later options or the pay by bank options. There's like 6 or 8 options now of how you can pay. Are those all part of this?
Those all, yes. I mean, yes and no, right? Those all are contributing factors to this overarching goal of driving conversion, right? At the end of the day, if you sell goods online, your number one objective is to sell as many goods as possible, right? And so those are more like conversion efforts. A lot of what we're talking about here is stuff you see behind the scenes as a consumer. Like when I give a merchant my credit card, I have no idea if they're using Stripe on the back end, Adyen, Checkout, Chase, or using all four of them, right? This is like very much like back end processes that we're talking about. But yes, like absolutely the proliferation of APMs, digital wallets, all of that stuff is in an effort to drive conversion. Again, especially on a global scale, right? The reality is here in the US, we're obviously a very card centric market. To your point, Europe tends to be more debit, more pay by bank. But then as you start to go to LATAM and different regions, like the preferences and payment rails are just, so varied.
Yeah. Okay. So let's jump to tokenization then. What is it?
Well, so first of all, I think it's important to distinguish like crypto/blockchain tokenization and what we do from a tokenization perspective. I tend to call it OG tokenization because the crypto folks kind of stole it from us. And so we're not talking about, putting assets onto some blockchain, right? What we're talking about is the data security technology of tokenization, which like at its most simplistic form is this idea of replacing sensitive data with a non-sensitive identifier. So taking a 16-digit credit card and replacing it with a random string of digits that are essentially useless if they got hacked. Now, underneath that, what you do with that raw 16-digit credit card is where vaulting and encryption and data security all comes in place. But the tokenization layer itself is this process of replacing sensitive data with non-sensitive data. And then as outbound requests are happening or that data gets shared outward, you do the reverse and replace the non-sensitive with the underlying sensitive data so that the other party can actually receive the plain text data.
And so the reason why a merchant might like this is because then they don't have to store all those credit card details and risk being hacked and risk having to pay for any fraud that comes off the back of that hack.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Look, I think there's another dynamic playing out here where like token management or an agnostic tokenization layer is important because, we're just moving into a world where, again, Google Pay and Apple Pay, those are token-based solutions, right? Like those are tokens that you put onto your phone, tokenized credentials, right? When you as a merchant go create a payment method with Stripe for card on file, you are tokenizing that with Stripe. When you as a merchant go out to Visa or MasterCard and you want to go provision a network token, you are tokenizing that card with them. And so you need a comprehensive way inside of your system to manage all of those different tokens. And so the way basis theory works is we basically say, hey, we'll operate at this like quasi, call it token orchestration layer, where we will give you as the merchant a single basis theory token. And then in the back end, we'll be able to allow you to associate that with a Google Pay transaction, an Apple Pay transaction, a card on file payment method with Stripe, a Visa network token. And now with agentic commerce, an agentic token as well. And so I think the needs for having, some sort of token management solution is only going to continue to increase as more and more different payment methods get tokenized. And we haven't even really seen tokenized identities hit yet either. And so as we start to tokenize PII and identities and this conversion of payments and identity, it's going to become even more important, I think.
Okay, so tokenization just being the technical way that you take a sensitive piece of information and give it a non-sensitive identifier such that you can go find it again. And basis theory's business at the moment is in the world of merchants and tokenizing the stuff that they use to manage their business, basically, in their payments. Yep. I want to just do a little sidebar on a little bit more about PCI compliance, because if you are tokenizing the payment details for all of these merchants that you work with, it sounds like you're taking on the PCI compliance for all of the merchants. Is that right?
Yep.
So what are the 3 or 4 key things around PCI compliance that therefore you at Basis Theory have to comply with?
I mean, again, so it's 160 pages of requirements. And basically what we say is, if you use basis theory to its fullest extent, we essentially handle 90-ish% of those requirements. So it's not a full outsource of PCI compliance. It's much more of a dramatic acceleration, I guess is what I would say. Like the reality is they still have to do some controls on their end as it relates to how employees interact with the system and some guardrails on front end components and things like that. But all of the nitty gritty nasty parts of PCI compliance we take on, which is the 90% of that. So yeah, I think that's important to call out. It's not like you can fully outsource this. And again, there's varying degrees by which PCI compliance, like you can adhere to it based on your volumes. And so there's like level 1, there's level 2, there's self attestations, right? And so again, like in the context of Stripe, you are essentially outsourcing it to Stripe, but you still technically have to do what's called a self-attestation. Now, Stripe basically, I think, automatically generates these for you. But even in that case, technically, you're supposed to say, here's my self-attestation that I'm doing PCI compliance. I'm just checking the box saying Stripe handles most of this for me. And then as you go up in volume and scale and or go up in the points in which your system is touching that data more directly, the requirements just scale up with that.
And is it stuff like, your data has to be stored in a certain type of data warehouse? Like, what are some of the key things?
Yeah, it's where the data is being stored. It's how it's being stored. What level of encryption are you using? What internal systems have access to that secure database or vault? How employees and which developers have access to those systems that ultimately have access to that data. And so there's systems controls and access controls, like it's all that kind of stuff.
Okay. So it sounds like a lot of the SOC 2 stuff as well, but just for this specific type of data.
Totally.
Okay.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So you have these merchants, they're taking card details to be able to take payments. You're tokenizing that information so that their risk of fraud losses is lower. Is fraud loss the biggest incentivizer here? I mean, you mentioned earlier that it's actually the merchant's desire to have multiple different payment processes. Like, talk about that a little bit. Why that? Why not the fraud loss? Like, is the fraud loss actually not that big of a deal for the merchants?
Well, so by tokenizing with basis theory, there's no inherent, improvement on fraud loss. I'd say where fraud tends to come in here is, again, if you then go tokenize that credential into a digital wallet, or put them through 3DS, like that's where you get the liability shift. I'd say the bigger fraud play by tokenizing data yourself, it comes from one of two ways. The first being, and I guess it's maybe there's a parallel back to your days at Monzo, but every token we create, every payment credential that we tokenize, we return back a unique identifier or a unique token for that credit card. But the other thing we're doing is we're also fingerprinting that data. So we're also using a cryptographic hash on that data. And so if you tokenize the same piece of data twice, you'll get back two unique tokens, but you'll get back the same fingerprint or the same hash of that data. And so now you can have a much more intelligent way to be like, wait a minute, I just saw that card being, swiped over here in California, and now I see it being used in an e-commerce transaction over in New York. That seems very odd. Let me look into that. And so it's more of a signaling play using these fingerprints. And then the other thing you can do by taking more control over that versus just outsourcing it to your PSP is you can start to work with, third-party pre-auth fraud providers. So you could start to work with a Sardine or a Forder or a Riskified, where prior to even pushing that transaction out to your PSP, you can do a quick pre-auth fraud. That's where you start to reduce fraud by taking more control over it.
Okay. I guess I was thinking of, if you're a merchant and you're storing all of that stuff yourself, you are at risk of being hacked and having all of that database stolen. And then that probably is like a merchant,
So
killing.
Totally. There's like a liability reduction play for sure, but there's no inherent reduction in fraud. It's more of a reduction in, your threat vector of being hacked.
Okay. Interesting. And so if I am a merchant selling in control swag online, and
You'd be sold out. They'd be sold out.
I think so. They're pretty cool. The real advantage to me then is with basis theory, I can take all these different types of payments. I can use all these different types of payment rails versus just using one PSB and being stuck with that one. Okay.
Yeah, right. Like you know, you might find that by just working with Stripe, you have a 95% auth rate in the US, but in Europe, you might have an 80% auth rate. And in LATAM, you might have an even lower auth rate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, so the challenge starts to become you're paying all these acquisition costs to bring people to your incontrol.com site to sell these sweaters. If you're only able to convert 6 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, it dramatically drives up your CAC, right? Mm-hmm. And so you might say, okay, I'm going to keep Stripe in the US because I have a 95% auth rate, but I'm going to add Adyen or Checkout in Europe because I think they can drive my auth rate up from 80 to 85 to 90%. And then down in LATAM, I'm going to, leverage dLocal or one of these to drive it up. And so it's like, it's all in this effort to, get as many good customers through the door as you can.
Got it. Okay. So recently MasterCard announced that they're going to be getting rid of the 16-digit PAN from their card. What does that mean in the context of this conversation that we're having?
Good luck. Good luck. I mean, look, so, the networks also said this when they started coming out with network tokens. So, maybe a quick primer on network tokens. So, say, 5 or 10 years ago, I would, again, send my, you give me your credit card. I'm a merchant. I use Stripe. I send it off to Stripe. They tokenize it, right? They send me back a token. Now I can process with Stripe anytime I want. If I add a second processor and say I add Adyen, I send that to Adyen. I get an Adyen token, but I can only use that with Adyen, right? And so the network saw this trend coming. And so they came out with network tokens. So a Visa network token, a MasterCard network token. And what those are credit cards getting tokenized at the network level, such that when I capture your credit card now, if I create a Visa network token or a MasterCard network token, both Stripe and Adyen, in theory, can accept that token. I don't have to send them individual tokens to get, or individual cards to get tokenized. And when the networks first came out with those, they offered interchange benefits, all these different things. But one of the requirements was you as a merchant have to purge the PAN. Like you're not allowed to store it yourself. And the merchants said, NFW, right? Like there was just so much pushback from them
Why?
Because they're already worried about how much, control and power the networks have over them. They're not going to just say, okay, yeah, we trust you, Visa, MasterCard. We're going to give up our ability to ever get back to, our customers, data. And they want to maintain control over that.
How interesting. I totally would have assumed it was the other way around, that the merchants were like, hell yeah, I don't want to store this data that someone could hack for. Therefore, if you want to just give me a Visa, MasterCard, which the world accepts, fine.
But this is the greatest trick the devil ever pulled, right? This is a data security technology, and you're absolutely right. On the surface, that sounds magical. But then, you know what Visa and MasterCard are going to do to you? After you use it for 2 years and you don't have data, they're going to say, you know what? We're actually going to increase the price of transactions when you use network tokens, and you're stuck as a merchant, right? Like, what are you going to do? You don't have access to that data anymore. You don't have the ability to go create Stripe tokens. Now you're forced to use these network tokens, and you're a completely captive audience to the networks. Again, like I'm saying, that's what Visa and MasterCard are going to do. I don't know if that's what they're going to do, but that is the risk of that, right? Like, just again, this whole idea of owning your destiny, owning your customer data, is a really important and real aspect of the strategy of these guys.
Do you know what percentage of card not present transactions are subscription or repeat payments versus one-off?
I don't have the stat. I will just say most of our customers tend to be either subscription merchants directly or high repeat, customer bases. So that's our purview, but I don't know the general stat.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that many merchants were that forward thinking rather than just, if this is a way for me to be, less of a target, be able to continue to accept my payments and not have to maybe, have so much PCI compliance requirements. Like that feels very appealing at the outset.
Again, like most merchants weren't building their own in-house vaults. They were outsourcing it to their PSP. So the option is I either outsource control and my destiny to Stripe or Adyen, or I outsource it to Visa and MasterCard. And I think what they're saying is neither of those are great options. I'd rather build it myself or work with a truly independent and agnostic third party like Basis Theory that doesn't have any skin in the game, so that I'm always in control of it. And so it's not like these network tokens were like necessarily reducing a ton of PCI scope, because they were already getting relieved of PCI scope by working with their PSP. It's just like it was a different option for them.
Got it. Okay. So back to MasterCard removing the PANs. This is their next attempt at just basically being able to provide a MasterCard or a Visa token.
Yeah.
Because each card will have this token.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I don't, obviously my good luck was a very flippant thing to say. I partly mean that, but I think like the reality is, we will partner with Visa and MasterCard on these efforts. And I think the medium or, the happy medium intermediary ground to find is like meeting Visa and MasterCard where they want to be, which is from a data security perspective, but also where the merchants want to be, which is a control perspective. And I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I don't think MasterCard's just going to be able to say no more PANs without the merchants, really pushing back.
Interesting. Okay. That is very interesting. Okay. So it also took the US so long to get to chip technology in cards that, this is like a decades long thing anyway, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay. So I guess we have to talk about agents. You already mentioned agentic commerce once or twice. I don't get it, and I want you to try to persuade me of it. And the reason I don't get it is because most of the stuff that people buy isn't stuff that they need, it's stuff that they want or that they like because of some kind of dopamine hit. And that doesn't exist if you outsource the actual acquisition of the thing that you're buying purely for a dopamine hit. So try to explain this to me. Explain why agentic commerce makes any sense.
I'm not the right person to do that. I'm probably more in your camp. Look, here's what I'll say. I think that there is a lot of confusion in the market as to what exactly agentic commerce is, or at least what we're talking about today, right? I think if I were to think about what the most logical, first principles definition of agentic commerce is, it's this idea of empowering an agent with a payment credential to go transact on my behalf. Some of, kind of the example you gave there. That's not what we're talking about. And we're nowhere near that. And I'm with you. I think there's a lot of questions about why we would want that or what use cases make sense. And what I'll say is, there are on the margin some use cases that make a lot of sense to me. For example, I have to throw a baby shower for a friend of mine, and I don't want to go buy all the, supplies myself. And I go to this agent and say, hey, go buy me a bunch of baby shower decorations and stuff. Here's a $200 budget. That makes sense to me. I think the canonical example that, we continue to hear is this travel booking use case, hey, I want to go to Hawaii in 6 weeks, monitor flights, monitor hotels for me, and go book that for me. I think that's completely stupid, right? I just think that we have so many consumer preferences around where we want to sit and hotel rooms, and it's hard to do that. But I think even more so, and you can relate to this, we're busy parents, we're running companies, our schedules change so much. It's great that I want to go to Hawaii in 6 weeks today, but tomorrow my plans might change. And so how's it going to accommodate for that? And then people are oh, well, you just give it access to your calendar. And I'm okay, but I don't update my calendar all the time. So what, are they going to read my mind? That use case makes no sense to me. The idea of, I read New York Times article about this really fun recipe. And I just say, and I send that recipe to Instacart and I say, hey, go buy me all these, all the ingredients for the recipe. That makes a bunch of sense to me. But again, like those are such narrow use cases on the edge. So I think what we're really talking about, at least today, is more what OpenAI is doing with ChatGPT Commerce, what Google's doing with UCP and the integration into Gemini for some of those use cases, which is very much human in the loop. And it's really just embedded checkout, not all that dissimilar to TikTok shopping and Instagram links and stuff today.
Yeah, so that is where I landed. On your website, you've got the sort of the 6-step example of how you can enable or help with agentic commerce. And it's step 1, user types in what they want to buy, pair of headphones. Step 2, the user selects the payment method. Step 3, the user consents verification. Step 4, a virtual card is created. Step 5, those card details are shared to the merchant. Step 6, the merchant confirms. That doesn't feel agentic to me. That feels like I'm producing a virtual card to lower risk, variety of risks, and I'm then using that virtual card to buy the thing I want. And like the incentive for a consumer to go through that process doesn't feel super high to me unless they are particularly worried about sharing their card details, which is just a fraud risk.
Yeah. Look, I think so. Agentic commerce to me is neither a payments fintech problem nor really a payments or fintech opportunity. Agentic commerce, again, let's go back to ChatGPT commerce. Where is the AI value in that? It's in the search, the discovery, the comparison, all of that. When it gets to the payments piece, it is existing payment flows. There's a step-up authorization. It's embedded checkout. And so agentic commerce, I don't mean to say like it's not a thing. It's just not a payments thing. It's like a search and discovery thing, right?
Thank you. I've been feeling really dumb, Colin, because I don't fucking get this. It doesn't feel agentic to me. And thank you for confirming that I am not, in fact, really dumb.
You're definitely not. No, but I think another way to think about it is if you look at the past 10 years, there's been this shift towards social shopping. We talked about Instagram and TikTok, and those are great examples of it. But really what that is just meeting the customer where they are from an intent and attention perspective. And ChatGPT is just the next social app. Just because it's AI powered doesn't really make it different than TikTok or Instagram from that's where my attention is. Now, yes, the chat-based component has some additional intent because I'm like, hey, I want a new TV. What TV should I look at? But let's be very clear. How often do you say to your friend, I need a new TV, and then Instagram has a TV ad for you? So not to get into conspiracy theory corner here, but I kind of think TikTok and Instagram have almost as much context as me talking to ChatGPT from wherever they get it.
Oh, I expect Instagram via, Meta has more information about you than AI. That I think that is right, but I think the analogy I'd make is that the OpenAI shopping experience is actually much more just like Googling something, because TikTok and Instagram is trying to give you something that you don't know you want yet, partly because it is always listening to you, so delete your Instagram app.
Totally.
But the OpenAI commerce experience is much more like Google. I need this thing. Help me figure out which one I want. So it's actually and given, the actual card acquisition purchase piece of that is just embedded payments. It's it is not this huge shift from where we are today. Okay. This makes a lot of sense to me. And
now, where I will say, I think there's an interesting opportunity for agentic payments is less in this context for all the reasons we just talked about. And frankly, the reason you brought up around, a dopamine hit. But I do think depending on what the new internet looks like from a content perspective, there might be an opportunity for agentic payments to play a role in that. And what I mean is, if you look at what's happening today or has happened to date, these big model companies, the labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, they're licensing content from Reddit and New York Times and these like big bulk license fees, right? They're saying, hey, we'll pay you $150 million a year to license all your content. There's a world where that doesn't make sense or goes away. And OpenAI, Google, Perplexity, they say, hey, rather than that, we want to access your content on a query by query basis, and we want to pay a fraction of a penny every time. And if that is where this all goes, then micropayments are going to become a thing for the first time, really. And then I think there's an opportunity to think about crypto payments and agentic payments in terms of empowering those agents to access content on demand and make microtransactions.
But again, is
that's not how Web 2.0 played out, and like there's no evidence to suggest that that's how the new internet's going to play out in this agentic world, but it's a possibility.
Let's assume that happens, and small payments for access to little bits of information makes there are so many reasons why like this should have stuck. It should make sense. There are lots of places like content creators, like you could see this working. Yeah. Let's assume that works. That payment mechanism, though, I still don't understand why it's agentic, because again, it is just the creation of a virtual card or some kind of rule that says every time this happens, send this much money to this endpoint. Like what is the agent in that?
So again, I think if we're talking about microtransactions, fractions of pennies, cards don't make sense, one. And then I could extrapolate that a little bit further out and say the real dynamic here is whether we're going to see this decentralization of content providers, or content is going to continue to be aggregated into platforms like Substack and some of these existing properties. Because if that happens, then really it's just a billing problem. You don't need to actually pay fractions of pennies, but that requires trust. And these are trusted entities. We know who Substack is. We know who Condé Nast is. If we see this true decentralization of content, and I just want to put content out there through colinluce.com or whatever, and this agent comes, like there's no trust in that. And so we need real-time settlement. Therefore, I think we need crypto in the absence of trust. And so it becomes like a trust and decentralization vector, I think.
That might be true. I think my skeptic view of that is crypto was supposed to be decentralized, but Coinbase and all is just centralization fucking, it's fine. Not decentralized.
We should say then stable coins, and you could make the same argument, Circle and all these companies, but let's just say stable coins instead of crypto.
Okay, sure. But then again, that is crypto. That's not agents. Where is the agent play?
The agent is the one going out and making that payment to access the content to bring that back to the prompt or query I as an end user am looking for.
But can't you just do that with an API call? Every time. So
yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I feel like this is something that God, I hate this term so much. Big tech has thrown out into the world and is trying to make stick.
I'm with you. I'm with you, full stop. The optimistic take on that, though, would be, regardless whether it makes sense or not, to your point, could that happen through API? Yes, but it hasn't up until now. So whether it needs to be agents or not, maybe just because there's so much buzz and momentum around AI and agents, that's enough to make this all happen. Whether technologically it could have been done through an API or an agent, again, it doesn't matter. That's the more optimistic view on this. But I'm with you in general.
And that's really, really interesting because it's just about the shift of power.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Okay. Wow. That's a cool place to end. I am pleased we got to some spicy takes on agents. And Colin, thank you so much for joining me on In Control. Any final words on tokenization or agents or anything?
No, just that I'm a size large and I can't wait to get my sweatshirt.
It'll be in the mail soon. Thank you, Colin.
All right, thanks.